Where's Richard? Okay. Thank you. You heard what was happening. We were presenting our papers.
Yes, I heard. Is everything all right?
Everything's fine.
Who said it's Ruth?
Everything's fine. Okay. There you are. Good.
Well, at least you know who you are.
Okay. Is someone missing? Do we have everyone?
Brought out dark glasses and
Right.
No, okay. Give me just a minute. Excuse me a second.
Is this you? I think we lost half the audience.
Where's Captain?
Is it not down here yet?
Is there someone in charge who could actually do something about those lights? Got them shades.
yeah.
I think they're still on.
These don't work. Oh, they do work.
Does this one work?
Yeah.
How many students?
6 tables, about 40.
Oh, good.
It was
Oh,
an
that's
interesting
okay.
lunch.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your patience. I would like to say to you that we had before this program a student presentation session up at Pforzheimer House. So we were there with students and faculty presenting their scientific papers, undergraduates presenting their thesis work or other research work that they were doing, and we simply could not leave before they had completed their work. So that accounts for our being a bit late in getting started here. The moment we finished that session, we all came here as quickly as we could. I'm Alan Counter, Director of the Harvard Foundation and Associate Professor of Neuroscience in the Department of Neurology. And I would like to say how much I appreciate your presence here this evening. I can see that there's a great interest in science here, particularly in the issues that we're going to discuss today regarding science bias and cloning. Our talks earlier covered a wide spectrum of topics in science, from the physical sciences and engineering to biological sciences. But today we have an opportunity to talk to some real specialists who have ideas about where we are with regard to our present-day research and cloning, what we're doing that is either considered right or wrong, and how science is used and misused in the interest of a variety of things, including ideology. I'd like to begin by saying that I've had the privilege over the years of knowing and interacting with, and in one case teaching a class with, a very distinguished biologist here who's taken this issue quite seriously, and I know for the last 25 years he's contributed greatly to the issue of science bias, and trying to help us to understand where this can go wrong. I'd like to cite two of his books, first of all. He is Professor Richard Lewontin, Professor of Biology at Harvard. One of his books you might want to take a look at is called Biology as Ideology. I think you'll find this very excellent reading, and I think that he'll be able to elaborate a little bit more upon that today. But one of the books that the students and faculty of the Harvard Foundation have taken a great interest in, because he touches upon the subjects that we deal with quite a bit, is his new book on human diversity. And I would recommend this as well. It's a marvelous book. It's been reviewed quite highly by many reviewers, but I think the most important review was that of New Scientist that said, a compelling text for lay readers. So you might want to take a look at this. It'll relate not only to this topic in general, but to specific issues. And I must say I read it with both admiration and jealousy. Admiration for its concise and complete and very comprehensive understanding of many of the issues we face today with regard to biology, eugenics, genetics, and jealousy that I didn't write it. So I'd like to ask Professor Richard Lewontin if he wouldn't begin by making the introductory remarks on this topic.
Thank you, Alan. I guess. Well, it wasn't entirely clear to me what we were going to talk about in this panel, just from the title alone. My own view of the matter is that, first, that cloning, as another example of reproductive technology, has as its greatest implications not the biology, not what are called the ethics of cloning, although there are problems of individuals and so on, which arise, but as Alan has suggested, in the ideological realm. That is to say, the very fact that all these people are sitting at this table and you're all out there talking about cloning already shows the immense power over consciousness that the concept and technique of cloning has. I mean, why are we here? It's because cloning now stands for something that permeates the political and social ideology of every society I know of, in which people write things at any rate, and that is the importance of biology and a person's biology and genes in the determination of what that person is, both individually and socially. That is to say, it's a kind of fetishism of the biological aspect of individuals, which is brought together and accentuated in the whole notion of cloning. Why would anybody want to clone a human being? I guess is the first question. Not what the effects will be or what the circumstances are, but why is it even a problem? It's bound up with notions like the notion among adoptees and adopting parents, where children say, well, I really want to know who I am. I want to know what my real identity is, and that means I really want to find my real parents. I mean, they've been brought up by this couple or woman or man or whatever it is since the age of 3 months or 3 weeks, and suddenly at some age they want to find out who they really are by finding their real parents. What does that mean? It means that we only know what we really are if we know what our genes are and we know what our inheritance is in a biological sense. And that's a piece of, well, it's bad biology, it's bad sociology, it's bad psychology, it's bad everything. It's a piece of pure ideology and reflects the general view, which has been common for a very long time. It's not a 20th century ideology, it's not even a 19th century ideology, that blood tells, that what you really are is somehow contained in the composition, as we would say now, of your genome, that's what really counts, and therefore, if you really want to know who you really are, you've got to find out who your genes are, or what your genes are. And that's what cloning is all about. It is a concentration on and a fetishism of the notion of biological component of identity. And if it could be understood as that, if the error could be seen, then I think virtually all the interest in cloning would disappear. I mean, we hear a lot of scenarios about why humans would like to clone themselves. I can only think of one cloning scenario that has any sensible meaning, and that is that a child desperately needs some kind of cellular or tissue transplant, and because of the sensitivity of transplantation to genome, it's important that the tissue which is used as donor tissue for that child be as close genotypically to the child as possible. Then you could make some kind of argument for producing an organism, or at least some cells, from cloned material. But you could, of course, hope to, and you might say, well, maybe you could use the child itself as a donor for the tissue, but then if all those cells of the child are already defective, you couldn't do that. So there's some argument for some cases where genetic identity makes some sense. But in most of the cases considered, in most of the so-called ethical dilemmas, they involve a kind of biological, of an error about the meaning of biology, the desire of individuals to propagate themselves. But when they say they want to propagate themselves, they don't even mean their psychic selves or their social selves, or to the extent they do mean that, they think that the way they'll do that is by propagating their genic selves. And so I have, in one sense, very little patience, if I may say, with most of the discussions about cloning, about human cloning, which seem to me completely misplaced. And our task as biologists, or as ethicists, or as philosophers in general, or sociologists, or whatever, is not to try to deal at a serious level with many of the pseudo-ethical and pseudo-moral and pseudo-biological issues that are raised by cloning, but to confront directly and primarily the question of this fetishism of the gene, the fetishism of blood. And if we could dispense with that, then we're free to deal with what small residue remains of real problems that might arise in the case of cloning. Finally, there are these scenarios, for example, that totalitarian regimes will use cloning in order to create a race of robots to do their will. Totalitarian regimes have known in the past perfectly well how to control their populations. We don't need cloning to destroy whole groups of people who we find unsatisfactory. Those methods have already been, cheaper methods have already been invented. Cheaper methods of racism, of genocide, of brain manipulation have already been invented. We don't need fancy biological techniques. And anyway, we won't change anything by them. So I suggest that you take a very skeptical view of the deep importance of what cloning brings to us beyond its reduplication of that erroneous ideological view. That's my contribution to the problem.
Thank you, Professor Lewinton. At this time, I would like to introduce a distinguished professor of social medicine at the Harvard Medical School, who has also worked extensively in this area, and we would like to welcome her to our conference, and that's Dr. Mary Jo Del Vecchio. Good.
Thank you. Long name. I'd just like to raise a couple of issues around gender bias and race bias in science that may or may not bear on cloning in the future. And I'd like to begin with a story about a conversation I had with an undergraduate last evening. His name is Chris Radcliffe, and if he were here, I would have him tell you the story himself. I asked him what he thought about the title and putting these issues of bias and cloning together. And in a very serious way, he said to me that he felt that cloning could be the equivalent of the atom bomb of the 21st century. And I was quite startled by that, and I think it's because he's 20 and I'm 56, and he really did have an image of the horror that perhaps cloning would bring within control of the state. But I'd like us to step back for a minute and raise some questions that come from attitudes that we have about science in which what is experimental becomes routinized and becomes common. If we look at what happened when the atomic bomb was developed, we had a great deal of attention to the technology and not much to the potential consequences in the future. And that's an extreme example, but let's take something simple like ultrasound. When we think about the development of the technology, it's fairly straightforward. There wasn't a great deal of thought, I think, into what it might be used for. And we find, in fact, sex selection going on in certain places in the world. India is known as one of the places in which it happens through the use of ultrasound and the ability to identify the sex of a fetus. It simply becomes routine practice. There's not a great deal of thinking about this. If we take a step back further into an NIH-funded study, Normal Human Aging, that went on for 20 years from the late 50s into the late 70s, we find that normal human aging was a study that was carried out only on men, even though women live longer than men do in this society of ours. A good deal of science that was funded by the NIH for many, many years was carried out with participants with subjects who were primarily men. Men, the 70-kilogram man, who would no longer be, I think, the average man today, was considered to be the normal, and the other was the female. We have politics to thank for adjusting some of the gender bias in science, which isn't a gender bias necessarily bias against scientists who are women, but the bias in which the norm is defined as the male and the other is defined as the female. We have Olympia Snow and we have Pat Schroeder to thank for really working together with the NIH and the Women's Caucus to establish greater equity in terms of who is recruited to projects. After all, if you're going to give medication to women in the clinical setting, it makes sense to have randomized trials before you do give medication in the clinical setting, whether or not women are going through particular hormonal cycles. You know, the protection of the fetus was one of the main reasons why women were not recruited. There are some interesting questions also when we look at the issue of racism in science and race bias in science, and I think that, again, politics matters. If we look at the redefinition of the association of certain kinds of health problems with race to the association of certain kinds of health problems with racism, the work of individuals at the Harvard School of Public Health like Kennedy, Prothero Stith, Tony Earls, people like this are really changing the way science is being done and the way race categories are beginning to be looked at. It's because what was considered the norm, what was considered routine science was shaken up, and it was shaken up by politics. And I think that as we address the issue of cloning and bias, and I'm not sure where that would go in the future, we need to continue to shake up the questions from the perspective of politics and from the perspective of social critique. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is a member of the medical school faculty, and I would like to say to you that he spoke to us earlier at Pforzheimer House, where he was a selection of our students and faculty of the Harvard Foundation of this year's Harvard Foundation Award in Science. He is a professor of physical medicine and rehabilitation, the Carleton professor, and also director of the Spaulding Hospital for Rehabilitation. I would like to introduce to you Dr. Walter Frontera.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I'm honored to have the opportunity to share this table with distinguished speakers. I'd like to be brief initially, I guess, and suggest that we have maybe three other ideas or considerations that we should keep in mind as we talk about this topic. Many years ago, I started doing some research in the area of exercise physiology, and I was interested in looking at the normal physiological response to physical activity. And I found myself reviewing a lot of papers based on research done in men only. And we were concerned about that because we tried to do exercise training in women. And we didn't have any evidence to support some of the things we wanted to do. And it turned out that at that point in time, there were very few studies on exercise in women, and I couldn't really understand why that was the case until I read a report of the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, who actually prohibited women in the marathon race until 1984. And evidently because women were considered not to be appropriate for exercise training or sports competition, nobody was interested in doing research in that area. So I guess that goes with what you were saying before. Of course, things have changed, and a lot of people now are doing studies including women. And I think that's of critical importance. As you may know, a lot of diseases and conditions affect more women than men, and I think it's obvious that we have to understand the consequences of these diseases on their physiological function. The second thing that I would like to mention is that in my personal case, as I am interested in exercise and aging, I thought that this whole area of cloning research was extremely interesting because it made us think about the true definition of aging or age. And I guess everybody says chronological age does not mean anything in the sense that you do not have a good measurement of physiological function, that, for example, the age of retirement, 65, is completely arbitrary, that it doesn't have any functional meaning. If you think about the sheep, Dolly, I guess the question that I would ask is, how old is Dolly? And what is the true definition of aging in her case? Can we consider her to be an 18-month-old, 2-year-old, whatever animal, or an 8 or 9-year-old animal that has DNA that is 8 or 9 years old? So that I think it's kind of a direct consequence of this discussion on cloning, and it's making our life in aging research more difficult, actually. Finally, I'd like to mention that in terms of the genetics research, I do feel as a physiologist that we may be missing an opportunity here, that as we try to understand the genetic code and get to that very, I guess, level of understanding, that we may be missing the opportunity to integrate that knowledge and to understand the functional consequences of that research, which is something that I think we should all consider. So again, from my point of view, I guess, problem of having women as part of our studies in exercise physiology that we started doing several years ago, the actual effect of cloning, or I guess effect on the definition of aging that cloning research has had, and the issue of taking advantage of that research and using it for applied physiology is really what I am interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frontera. I would like to have a student begin our next presentation. And at this time, I'd like to ask one of the co-sponsors of this event. The group is Women in Science at Harvard Radcliffe, and the president is Ms. Elizabeth Chow, class of 2000.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here among a very prominent group of scientists. To introduce myself, I'm a second-year undergraduate here at Harvard. I'm concentrating in chemistry, and chemistry here is definitely a field where women, there's a very great shortage of women in the department. That's seen in the number of faculty, the number of women faculty who are currently on staff. The only tenured professor currently is Professor Friend. She's quite a woman, and she's very inspiring to speak to. She's very strong-willed. It's definitely an intimidating field. There's a shortage of mentors, a shortage of role models. Many of the supervisors that I've had during my undergraduate career as well as my high school career have been male. Although they've been very supportive, it's always very encouraging to see women who are in the department and know that you can aspire to be at that position. I'm the head of an organization at Harvard. It's Women in Science. And our main goal is really to serve as a resource for many of the women undergraduates on campus. We were kind of at at the crossroads earlier this year because there was the expressed belief that there's now a smaller discrepancy in the number of women scientists in biochemical sciences, in biology, but the disparity is still seen in fields like physics, mathematics, computer science. Many of the people that I know who are concentrating in those aspects, from very early on, they had a lot of experience in that area, or they grew up in an environment where their parents were professionals in physics or mathematics. And throughout the year, Women in Science, we provide a number of panel discussions. We have a mentoring program where upperclassmen mentor younger students in science and mathematics and computer science and physics and engineering and all the different aspects of science. We have panels like these where we invite women professors, women professionals from off campus to come and speak to some of the students in the hopes that either there would be some form of networking. And many of the students have actually kept in contact, and actually some of them have ended up working for some of the guest speakers that we've had. And I see that disparity starts to become very prominent when you move on to the more advanced areas in science, such as graduate school. And once you go into academia or in industry, there's what's known as, I'm sure if you've all heard of the Leaky pipeline in science. Sometimes, elementary school students, they start off with a great interest in science, and as they pursue their degree, there starts to be a drop-off. And we can't really gauge, we're not there to figure out at what stage it is that they start to drop off, but we're there to serve as a resource for many of the women here on campus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move now to one of our professors. Dr. David Haig is Assistant Professor of Biology here at Harvard University, and he also has addressed the broader issues of the social aspects of biology and some of the issues our students have in mind today. So, Dr. Haig.
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking me to talk. I'd really prefer to sort of throw it open and get your questions, and it's easier to deal with practical issues in that sort of way. I don't know that I've got any particular expertise to speak on social issues, but when we're thinking about some of the social issues of routinization of science, creating a market and a desire for various forms of reproductive technologies, I think it would be good to actually think about the practical cases of real people. When cloning was announced, it was a little deja vu, some of the things that were being said in the press. They reminded me of some of the things that were said back when the first IVF baby was announced. And now IVF has become a very, very routine part of medicine, and a whole series of it's not just one procedure. There's now a whole series of procedures being offered. Now it's all very, I decry in many ways with Dick the fetishization of genes, but I also know a lot of women who are wanting to have children and going through those sort of programs. Do they have, as some of them do, feel very, very strongly that when they seek a sperm donor, they want to know a lot of things about that particular sperm donor? I have a friend who's very, very emphatic that she feels she needs to know everything there is to know about this man, and feels that it's a feminist issue that she should have that information. What do we say to her? I was just reading. I was reading today, actually, some information on the history of sex ratios in Chinese censuses going back into the 1930s, and the current excess of males in current generations is not a new thing. That there was a similar excess of males in the censuses for the cohorts going back to the 1930s and the early 1940s. Interestingly, that discrepancy plummeted during the early decades of the communist control there, and now it's creeping up again. Now, in the 1930s and 40s, clearly that it's suspected that the the missing females were the result of infanticide or neglect during the very first years of life. Now we're looking at sex-biased, sex-selective abortion. What do we want to do about that? You know, India is another area where there is a high use of sex-specific abortion. What would be the consequence if we outlawed the procedure? Are we going to replace sex-specific abortion with neglect and death of girl children during their first 12 months of life? I think it's a moral issue that we need to talk about. I absolutely decry valuing one sex more highly than the other, but we don't want to get in a situation, for instance, like the people who refuse needle exchange programs because they disapprove of drug use, and as a consequence promote the spread of HIV into other populations who would otherwise be affected. So I'd like us also to think about general principles, but also issues of practical policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hay. At this time, I'd like to introduce our last speaker on the panel before we go to our questions and our discussion. And she's a graduate of the class of 1998 at Harvard in biological sciences, where she did a considerable amount of research. And she's presently at the Harvard School of Education pursuing a master's degree and will enter medical school next year. And she is Ms. Nana Coleman, who's the Student Activities Coordinator at the Harvard Foundation.
Thank you very much. You'll have to excuse my voice. As you can probably see, I have a pretty bad cold that I'm trying to get through, so pardon me if my voice falters a little bit. As Dr. Connor said, I am a future physician, an aspiring medical school student, and so when we were trying to think of a topic to speak on for the science conference, this is something that was very interesting to me, both in terms of its present relevance in today's society, this topic, but additionally in terms of the future ethics that will be part of my life as a physician in the future. What I'd like to talk about very briefly and sort of get all of you thinking about this evening are issues pertaining to eugenics, essentially modes and means of obtaining what I think many have termed, quote, the fittest and purest of societies that have transcended history in recent centuries. What I'd first like to do is offer you a brief historical account of the eugenic methods and issues that have been pretty much a part of this society since earliest times, and then offer a bit of a more recent application of these issues, and then lastly bring up some ethical concerns and issues that are raised, which might hopefully serve as a topic of discussion for this evening. With the rediscovery of Mendelian genetics, or classical genetics as it's pretty much called these days, there were a lot of opportunities for eugenics and social policy to be related. In fact, in recent years, this body of knowledge that was established early in the 19th century has been restructured, has been stretched, has been redefined to accommodate the needs of society. Excuse me. Although the relationship between heredity, medicine, and society has always existed, there are certainly more prevalent issues that have arisen in the past few years, given the growing knowledge in science and technology, and even more so the growing demand for some of these technological measures that have been recently put in place. As I said before, earlier on in society, eugenic methods were used to obtain what many have termed to be the fittest and purest societies, and in terms of what constituted or what defined that sort of society, it did vary throughout the world, but many of these trends were in response to the trends of nationalism and nativism that preceded and also followed the Second World War in the United States and overseas. Anything ranging from the forced sterilization of people who were termed as, quote, feeble-minded or not intellectually sufficient or contributing positively to American society, or even punitive sterilization for criminals who were thought perhaps to have carry genes that might allow them to have children that would further, quote, taint society. All of these were issues that were very closely related to the matter of eugenics, and in a lot of cases were the motivating forces behind it. Naturally, with the issue of eugenics, there were a lot of crosses between law, legality, religion, social policy, as I've said. And considering the history of eugenics and comparing it to what it is today, there are still a great deal of intersections between a number of fields. This is an area that's especially interesting to me as first a woman, being a minority in that sense, but also as a racial or ethnic minority, in that as you think of the trends that we're facing today in society, the idea of who or what will be the perfect child, who or what will constitute the perfect society, I think sometimes, will that perfect person look anything like me or anything like the people up here on this panel? And I think that's one of many issues that we should raise and consider as we're looking towards the issues of eugenics. Beyond that, I think it's important as we think of cloning, as several individuals on this panel have referred to this afternoon, the idea of creating the perfect baby, the idea of cloning people, the idea of making unusual combinations of people, objects, and things into a new robotic or new better being than we all presently are. I think that naturally there are a lot of dangers and concerns that are raised with the advent of modern and increased technological advances, and I think that those should be the basis of our discussion for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Coleman. Let me say, too, as we move into questions and further discussions, some of which we hope you'll bring to our panelists, and I will initiate some as well, I would like to recognize someone in the audience who has made a great deal of contributions to this area of social aspects of biology. She's actually helped to lay the foundation for women's studies and has made wonderful contributions in this area, and that's Dr. Ruth Hubbard. Will you just stand so we can recognize you, Dr. Hubbard? I would like to start by saying that Professor Lewington, as students raise these issues to me, they talk about, for example, the recent publicity given to a well-known proponent of cloning who says that he is going to create a child without imperfections. And I mean, that strikes us as rather odd. I think that I happen to like my imperfections, and why should we have a child with no imperfections?
Who's this guy going to clone? I mean, if you're going to make a child without imperfections by cloning, you ought to have somebody who already exists without imperfections, right?
Well,
who's the donor? Did he say himself?
he's a physicist. So
Yeah, right.
Any further comment on that?
You ask why a child with no imperfections, or?
Well, I was just trying to get feedback. I mean, that's been the latest discussion.
I mean, my personal view is perhaps not as sophisticated as Professor Lewontin's, but my feeling is that naturally there are a lot of issues that are raised in trying to achieve who or what that level of perfectness defines. I think as someone who's participated in activities and events and courses and so forth that have really prided themselves and valued ethnic, cultural, social diversity and uniqueness, I think it really represents a very tragic view to even have the predominant idea of trying to strive for a level of perfection that may really not exist.
Dr. Frontera?
Just want to comment that this may be related to our discussion earlier this afternoon, but that some of those traits that we may identify as imperfect traits or conditions really result from the interaction of the biology and the environment. This is like, again, as discussion about disability, for example, that results not only from the actual illness or disease or whatever, but actually the effect of the environment on that person. So maybe in order to produce that perfect person, we're going to have a perfect society. I really wonder if that is possible at all.
Dr. Frontera,
One of my colleagues, Leon Eisenberg, suggested that we think about what we're doing if we're going to clone yesterday's people for tomorrow's problems, and can there ever be anything that is perfect? No.
Could I make a comment about more to the heart, perhaps, of what this panel was about, which is science bias? The fact, again, that we are concerning ourselves about cloning is a kind of a reinforcement in practice of the importance of cloning itself. That is to say, if you think cloning is important, then you not only talk a lot about it and write books about it and appear on TV about it, but you spend money on it. And if you spend money on it, money is finite, time is finite. If the donors of money think cloning is important, or if capitalists think cloning is important and they spend a lot of money on it, that makes it more important. And so the thing goes around and around and around, and the bias in science arises from this ideological commitment to what's important. I mean, scientists do what they can do, what they know how to do. It's another thing about cloning. Once you learn how to do something, then you do it, because what else are you going to do? So a lot of science bias arises not just from ideological standpoint, but from that other standpoint, that scientists are trying to make a living, if I may put it so crudely, and they have to make a living doing what they know how to do. And what cloning does is to offer this immense possibility for making a successful living.
Well, it involves the word selection, and we talked earlier, and I wondered if Professor Haig would say something further about this whole issue of selection, whether it's gender selection, or is that another form, as you seem to suggest, of sort of a cloning idea that, you know, you're selecting individuals on the basis of some special characteristics?
Well, I think that, you know, there is a lot. Let me be clear on that. There's a continuum from efforts that are made in some sense to select a child that is in some ways genetically better than they would have been, and we can, you know, there is now a lot of prenatal diagnosis going on for a variety of conditions, and I see that as a continuum through hormonal treatments that are being used to make short children grow taller. You know, we now have recombinant growth hormone, so we've got a product, and we're looking for potential uses of it. It's, you know, really being pushed by Genentech, who make that. You know, they would like a nice big market there. We're also hormonally, and I know of a number of cases of this, making girls who look like they're going to grow very tall to bring on premature puberty to so that they're a nice 5 foot 10 inches rather than 6 foot, which would be you know, a disadvantageous height for a woman to be, even though we know that the earlier puberty occurs, the greater the risk of breast cancer and a whole series of conditions. So one thing that's coming up there, as a biologist, the whole idea of some variation being normal and other variation being abnormal makes no sense whatsoever. It's just variation. But so much of medicine and what we're trying to achieve with people is a different sort of normality, that you know, rather than accepting a whole range of variation of heights, rather than accepting crooked front teeth as I have, you know, we're trying to perfect people in various ways. And so I think there are very important issues there. What is defined as an abnormality that needs to be corrected, and what is just the natural part of human variation? This has come up with the question of attention deficit disorder in schools. Now we have a large proportion of the school children in the United States suffer from a recognizable disorder that can be treated with the use of some sort of drug. Previously, presumably there were the same number of children, but it wasn't a disorder at that time. It was part of natural variation. And so once again, the practical issues: how do we decide which parts of variation are things that need to be corrected, and which parts of variation are things that we just accept? I was reading an article in the New Yorker about hair color. You know, is hair dye, is that something that we should feel neutral about as changing our genetic endowment or our outward phenotype? Personally, I couldn't care less about hair dye. But there's a complete continuum from, you know, minor phenotypic modifications to these genetic modifications, and I do worry that there's a tendency to become narrower and narrower in our definition of what is normal and desirable to be as a human being.
Mm-hmm. But David, on that issue, could you tell us, is there any data on selective abortion by sex in the United States?
I don't think there's any data on that. People probably avoid it entirely, but now with prenatal diagnosis and with elective terminations, surely there are some people who are using the information that they get from various genetic tests to make such decisions. There is there are some very strong supporters in the assisted reproductive technologies favouring prenatal sex selection. The major consumer demand at the moment seems to be for people who want, we're talking now within the United States, people who want one of each, who want both, want a nice family size, one boy and one girl. I don't think that there's a major demand in the United States for selective abortion that's directed specifically against girls or against boys of that sort.
Maybe Dr. Delvecchio could elaborate on perhaps why this exists in some of the Eastern societies where there is a gender bias in selection. Can you say anything about that, or this
We might go
placing of
back
value?
to limited amount. We might go back to the Indian case where, as with the Chinese case, there's long discrepancy in sex ratios, and I think that we see here both preference for, say, male children, but also a very insidious way of dealing with female children the first year of life. And so, again, the issue of sex selection, the use of ultrasound or other kinds of technologies, really do raise the questions that you were beginning to address earlier about whether or not that is a better way than to have girl children dealt with, as sometimes they are, by families who have very limited resources. And I think if we look at the issue of poverty and we look at the issue of what societal resources are available for families, we can see a very strong correlation between sex selection and those kinds of social resources that are available.
Well, what implications might this have for race? I know that Ms. Coleman had earlier raised a couple of points. In this whole notion of science bias, we have everything from the recent publicity about the studies done in such places as Tuskegee to other studies regarding health. And there is developed at NIH now a special section that deals with issues of minority health. Can you sort of elaborate, anyone, on the implications of science bias for race?
Yeah, the implications are if groups don't make a lot of trouble and demand some power politically, then problems which are more common among them never get touched. I mean, do you remember when nobody talked about sickle cell anemia? And sickle cell anemia only becomes an issue for science when the groups who have an abnormally high frequency of it begin to shake the trees a little. I mean, I think it's a clear political story there.
Dr. Frontera?
Another example could be the HIV situation. You don't have the pressure of the people that suffer from the disease, putting pressure on those who do the research and the government to assign the funds. It doesn't happen.
Surely the increase in political consciousness and to the extent that it's occurred, political power of women has had an effect on research on breast cancer, no? Or not?
Major.
And certainly the methods of treatment.
And
Would you like
just-
to say a couple of these?
I was just going to further the points that Elizabeth made earlier, that I think this draws attention to the fact that there is a necessity for minorities in the field of science. And I know that at the very heart of this conference that we're doing, that is always something that we consistently try to remind individuals. And I think, as each of the professors has expressed, it is true. And speaking from the perspective of a minority in science, I know for myself that even though I may not be a scientist purely, or I may have other interests, I think that just the fact that I'm in the field or that I'm willing to do the science, I think that it at least draws, like you said, attention to the particular diseases. It draws attention to sickle cell and others, and it makes people more aware of the need for funding and for the fact that these are relevant diseases, if even to a specific population, but in reference to all of us as well.
Ms. Chow, would you like to say something on that?
Yes, I just want to make a comment about the fact that there is a stipulation that there tends to be a lot of Asians in the sciences, and I just wanted to touch upon that subject very briefly. First of all, there's the stereotype that typically, most Asians just, in my family, both of my parents come from a background, my father is an economist, and my mother is an accountant. I come from a background where education is valued very highly. And from where my parents were born, they were both born in Taiwan. And one of the most highly valued fields was in the medical sciences. That was probably one of the most respected fields at that time, as well as mathematics and physics. And it's unique because I go into chemistry, and neither of my parents have had any background in that. They've been very supportive as I have been growing up. And although it seems that there's a lot of talk about, oh yeah, there's certainly a lot of Asian participants in the field of science, I don't really think that's something that is, we're still a minority in the field. And I think sometimes the issue is a little overstated. And I think it's very important to realize that there's still a lot of minorities in science, and it's really, really important to encourage that in any way. And I also want to address, there was about the topic of perfection. First of all, how do you achieve perfection? Who is there to determine what is perfect? There was a study once that was done where there were two children, and one was African American, and she was supposed to choose between two dolls. One was from her own ethnicity, an African American doll, and the other one was blonde hair, blue-eyed. And when she actually reached for the blonde hair, blue-eyed doll, she was asked, why would you choose someone who doesn't look like you? And she said, well, actually, that's what I think I do look like, or that's what I would like to. And I don't know if that's, I think it has a lot to do with social construct as well, the environment. And I just thought that was an interesting study that was done a while ago.
Well, speaking of that, Professor Lewington, you have lectured extensively on the whole notion of race as it relates to intelligence, or the assertion that race and intelligence are linked. And I don't know if you could, along the lines of sort of scientific discussions regarding what many believe to be biases, just make a few remarks about that. And we've had discussions here recently related to some of the books that have come out on IQ and race and so forth. And I don't know how well the audience has been briefed on this, so you might want to say a few things and we can maybe take off from that.
I don't know, Alan. I mean, is there really anybody here who... No, I mean, is that something we really need to go over? No, I'm not trying to be difficult, but my guess is that this is not a crowd that needs to have a discussion of race and IQ,
But if you could just say something in relation to bias in science about it, or in terms of...
Well, I mean, along the lines I said before, I guess the question is why so many people, especially in psychology, make a living by studying it? Well, no, but you talk about bias in science means what people do. And I was once with Luca Cavalli on with a two-person committee appointed by the NIH to make a recommendation to the NIH about whether they should fund studies of the heritability of IQ. And we wrote a white paper and said, it's a waste of the taxpayers' money, cut it out. And they did. But that's because they were looking for an excuse to save money, and if two people on the panel would say that was not worth doing. Science is a self-validating enterprise. And the fact that there are professors who are paid big salaries to study the heritability of IQ, and there are such people, is itself a demonstration that it must be worth doing, right? Because if it weren't worth doing, they wouldn't be professors being paid to do it. I mean, we have to recognize the society we live, getting paid for something is already a validation of it. I mean, this is not the time to go into the question of the family wage and housework, but I mean, that's a long history. And so, and professors have become, and scientists have become in the last 40 years, well, since the Second World War, one of the chief sources of popular legitimacy. If I run a newspaper or a magazine or a TV program or radio program, I have a long panel of professors or scientists who might call up and say, would you appear on my TV program as an expert? We have this cult of expertise. And believe me, you have to work hard not to get on the radio. So again, science becomes biased by the reduplicating self-validation and self-legitimization of that problem. So look, nobody would study the heritability of IQ if somebody didn't think that it was important to do and if it didn't serve a social function. Of course, it serves a very important social function. But
Well, when
everybody
it comes to
knows
race, I mean, that's, is that the social function? Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah, look, I mean, if we're talking about North America, North Americans, white North Americans, European ancestry North Americans, have a long-standing, serious ideological problem, which is that they learn the mantra when they go through elementary school: all men are created equal, they're endowed by the Creator, blah, 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 blah. You know, I mean, I learned that. I guess you probably learned it too, yes. And it's all men, of course, and so. And they have that, and then they have the fact that they have to cope with the existence of social classes, the existence, the attempt to put people down in various ways. So you have to invent excuses. I don't know what else to put it. You have to invent an excuse for slavery. You have to invent an excuse for de-development of colonialized countries. You have to invent an excuse for marginalization of a large fraction of the population who are easily identifiable by skin color. I mean, you have to do all those things. So one of the excuses you invent is, first of all, to hypostasize mental over physical labor and say IQ is what matters in life. I mean, that's really what's important, is what's your brains. And then you have to show that those people are where they are, not because of any social arrangement, but because in the race of life, they are slower runners. I mean, what we've had is a change from the ideology of all men are created equal to the ideology of what they mean. What's meant is all persons are born with an equal right to run the race of life. But of course, in the race of life, as an exercise, some people get ahead and some people don't. And so you can have an equal opportunity society, and if you don't make it, that's because you're intrinsically unworthy. That's what it's all about. It's an attempt to legitimize the inequality in the face of an ideology of equality, a problem which did not exist in the ancien regime. I mean, you didn't need the heritability of IQ when serfdom was the normal run of things, because you didn't need to explain anything. That's the problem that modern technological European society has to deal with. How does it confront itself? How does it rationalize its own deviation from its constantly repeated ideology of equality? And that's the answer. You make it up that way.
We'll take questions if you have them. If you want to go to the microphones, please. We were simply waiting anyone to come to the microphone, and we do know that at the JFK School there are always questions. We'll ask that they be questions, in fact, and not statements. So if you could please take full advantage of this
We're the only one allowed to make it.
talented panel and just ask questions. We'd appreciate it. Yes, ma'am. And you can direct it at any panelist you like. If you wish.
Yeah, I would like to address my question to, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Ruth. Is that how you pronounce your name?
That's one possibility.
Okay.
It's a perfectly legitimate possibility.
You're answering, so you're the correct person. You made a statement just now, and I want to say something before. I'm not trying to be sarcastic. I'm not trying to be a wise. First of all, I graduated from Harvard, so I'm an alumni. So I'm not stupid either. I don't mean to be, a wise guy, but this is a very serious question, and it's a very serious thing that you're discussing now. It's even more serious because it's affecting an awful lot of people, directly and indirectly. You made a statement about, about the money angle on the thing. Now, researchers are very happy to get a lot of money from the pharmaceutical people. And once the pharmaceutical people grab on to something, it's terrific. They make money by the millions, maybe billions. Then it comes to the doctors who have to treat the patients. The patients, 3/4 of the patients, if they're on Medicare, it's like a dirty word today. They don't have the money for the drugs that they need, and they also don't have the money for the doctors that they need. And the doctors say, give me the money up front. If you don't give me the money up front, then I won't treat you. It happens with the dentists, it happens with the doctors, and you are the people who are training some of these doctors who are doing all these kind of things. And the people die out. They have to go on welfare, and when they go on welfare, they go to the state building, and I was there and I watched it, and they had lawyers. And the doctors didn't want to treat them. And a matter of fact, the Governor Weld, and I was there, took them off the welfare. And so there was no, they just died out, the people. Nobody cared. And you people that are sitting over here, I mean, you are the one who should be responsible for something like this. So my question to you on this whole thing is, what are you people going to do? Forget about the bias. There are plenty of black American doctors who did a lot of wonderful research. I was a history major, and I know they did an awful lot of great work, and as well as the white doctors and researchers. So bias is the bottom line. It's not a big deal. I mean, if a person is good, they can be purple, and people will respect them. The idea is, what are you people trying to do for the average person who has to go to a doctor? That's my question.
Thank you. The question this lady's asking is, what are we going to do in the training of doctors and people to work with these people?
Yeah,
Okay.
training the kind of people. Character is the most important thing.
I agree.
Don't see it.
Dr. Frontera, do you want to start with that, or as one who trains doctors?
Well, I think you mentioned a lot of significant issues in healthcare today, and one of them has to do with changes in healthcare, managed care, and all of the things that come with it. The pressure on the doctors nowadays are tremendous as a result of the changes in the healthcare system, and I think that there's a significant risk of losing on the quality side of the care if we continue on this track. And I hope that this will be reversed or changed, at least, in terms of the direction of those changes. There is pressure on everybody, the doctors and the patients and the hospitals, and maybe even on the HMOs and the managed care institutions. The second issue that I think the only answer to that may be a reaction of the patient population, a reaction of the public. I think patients have to speak out and tell people how they feel. And some people do, of course. Others, I think it's taken some time for them to react to what is happening. Unfortunately, some of those reactions, of course, have resulted in legislation, like for example, the issue of short-term hospitalizations for delivery and breast cancer surgery and all of that resulted in legislation to, I guess, prevent or prohibit those things from happening again. But we cannot legislate a disease at a time. We have to have an understanding of the bigger picture. The second thing that we have to do, of course, is the other issue is in our education programs. I think we have to discuss this with our students and residents, and discuss the implications of all of these changes on the delivery of health care. And I can tell you we do this all the time. We have it in our programs. But it's not an easy topic because a significant part of the problem is really out of our hands. At least that's the way we feel in the hospitals and in the clinic. When you are with the patient, when you discuss the condition, when you prescribe a medication, when you order a diagnostic test, and half an hour later you get a call from someone in an office from an insurance company telling you that this cannot be done. someone who didn't see the patient, who didn't talk to you or the patient. And it's really, it's a significant risk, I think. We're trying to address that by educating our doctors on how to deal with that. But if part of the problem is outside of our hands, then I think we're limited in that sense. I don't know if any of
Thank you for your question. I hope it was answered now. We have at the other microphone, Professor Ruth Hubbard.
I'm troubled by the fact that there hasn't been enough talk about money. It's been mentioned a couple of times, but not enough. And it seems to me that science bias, and especially if we're going to talk about cloning, what we need to talk about is money. The reason we have cloning is because it's been invented as a profitable way of getting animals that can produce more cheaply chemicals that will be profitable. That it is then talked about in terms of humans, it seems to me is sort of just a distraction, a diversion from the fact that this is one of the big moneymakers. And all the IVF, I think, is in a similar boat in a way. It's another big moneymaker. And all these things get then turned into ways of generating needs, if you wish, among people who do have needs, but that become profitable for the people who can provide what supposedly these people need, though that's not at all clear. So in a way, I'm worried or concerned why we're even talking about human cloning. I mean, Dick asked that question too, but it's not the issue. The issue is cloning for commercial purposes. And to pay any attention at all to the human aspects of it, I think is just sort of a straw man, woman, child that we're putting out there. That's not a question, but I guess it is a question.
Except, Ruth, that there will be money made in human cloning if what's cloned are tissues for transplant and stuff like that. That's also be money-making.
Would anybody like to comment on that? Professor Haig or Dr. Delvecchio, good?
I think that's the point, that we do have to talk about money when we talk about money, though perhaps we have to talk about some of the scientific imaginary that goes into this. If you think of the political economy of hope driving the desire to move into the human cloning area precisely to perhaps develop have an organ transplant.
Yeah, but for that you don't have to clone people, and
That's
yet,
true.
you know, all
Exactly.
the ethical debate is about cloning people, and there's just, no one has brought up any legitimate reason for doing that. So in a way, it bothers me that we're sitting here talking about cloning people as though that were a real issue confronting us as a society.
Thank you, Professor Hubbard. We'll take another question here.
Yes. Hi, my name is Alex Nguyen. I only used to be a pre-med, so I hope you can forgive me if my science is inaccurate. It seems to me that medicine has moved from a role as medicine as a cure to medicine as prevention to medicine as enhancement to medicine as recreation. Two examples come to mind. One is Ritalin, which used to be used to cure ADD. Now it's being used to enhance performance in children. Viagra used to be used as, enhancement for men, but I hear it can be used also for women to enhance pleasure. My question is, where do you see cloning falling on that spectrum, and whether or not do you feel that the medical profession has a role in dictating what medicine should be used for, in terms of being used as a cure, prevention, enhancement, or recreation?
Who would like to take that on? Anybody in particular? Or?
Well,
Please, Professor Haig.
yeah. I agree with Ruth Hubbard that I don't think there's really much serious discussion of, apart from physicists, of human cloning out there. I think one of the things that's happening in America in the whole area of reproductive technology in general is that there are just so many difficult issues tied up, in particular with the abortion debate within this country, that Congress and whatever just doesn't want to get involved. And so very much more so than most other countries in the world, all the decisions of what research is done are thrown out into the commercial sphere and into commercial regulation of what's going on. It's a lot easier to practice an experimental treatment on a woman coming into an IVF clinic than it would to do the equivalent experiment on a mouse. For a mouse, there's an incredible bureaucracy and animal rights committee that you've got to go through, but because politicians don't want to get involved in these more difficult issues, it's just whatever each individual doctor wants to do out there, and there's very little regulation at all. I don't know how we get round that, but I think that's part of the politics in the States at the moment. And who knows, if politicians don't regulate, who knows, there may be a human clone sometime in some lab somewhere. I don't know. I don't think a human clone is creates any metaphysical problems. They'd be just another human like any other with human rights. They definitely wouldn't be identical to the same person as whoever they were cloned from. But yep, I don't see it happening soon.
Is that satisfactory? Thank you. We have another question over here, please.
I guess I just wanted to express concern about what I'm sort of hearing as a premature closing down of the debate about the ethics and potential applications of human cloning, because I don't know that all those avenues have been explored. I can see lots of sinister uses for human cloning, but I could also imagine potential applications that would be quite useful. Perhaps, with regard to IVF, cloning embryos so that women don't have to be given drugs to produce a lot of eggs. That's, one example, but I think there are a number of avenues that may be useful that are not sinister, and I just wanted to hear if the panel had other potential applications for human cloning that were worthy of discussion. I just wanted to throw that out.
Anyone who'd like to address that?
Well, I can. I talked at a conference in, I've forgotten where. I talk at so many where there were numbers of people from the IVF industry there, and numbers of them who were talking about wishing that they could do it. And the one that always comes up is an azoospermic male who can't produce sperm, who produces no sperm at all in his testis. And so then you could take a nucleus from some somatic cell of his body and put it into an egg, and he could then perpetuate his genetic material in that way, but no other way. And so apparently there are some men out there who want that procedure. Dick mentioned the fetishization of genetics. I talked to this doctor actually, and I said, well, what about the issue of, we're looking at a couple, and, who gets to decide whether it's his DNA that is cloned or hers? And he said quite straight-faced, oh, it's fair, she's providing the mitochondria. So that's, I'm serious.
All right, just to take it out of the realm of genetic fetishism, what about something like bone marrow? I don't know if I'm correct about that, but is there an application of human cloning for something like bone marrow, which is so specific?
Well, I mentioned the fact that one could imagine cases, there are cases where you want to produce a large amount of tissue or a certain amount of tissue of identical genotype to someone who's living in order to produce a transplant. And Ruth mentioned that also. I mean, there's tissue cloning, but that does not require cloning an entire individual. Of course, there may be such cases, especially in transplantation, when every deviation from identical genetic similarity is a greater risk of the failure of the transplant. Sure.
Even, there are companies now, they're offering.
Sorry, but there's no, I don't understand where the ethical issue arises. I mean, if, in the particular case of transplant, are you talking about cloning the tissue of the recipient itself? No, you don't want to give the leukemic person back its own marrow, I don't suppose. So then you're going to take marrow from somebody else who's closely genetically related, but no more than 50%. I mean, you haven't solved the problem there, unless it had an identical twin. And if that identical twin didn't happen to have the disorder, then you could take marrow. So we now have the question of instrumentality. Is there an ethical issue arises if we produce an identical twin of somebody in order that that identical twin's tissues could be used as transplantation? That's one of those scenarios that people talk about. And but my only point was, if those scenarios ever exist, fine, then let's worry about them in those particular cases, but that doesn't become a big issue. Because again, it can be done by tissue. You don't need a whole individual. One of Napoleon's marshals was once asked by a nobleman who his ancestors were. And he said, "I am the ancestor." And I think if people sort of remember that would be helpful.
Okay. Hope that's answered. We have another question here.
Yes, I just wanted to bring 2 points to the panel and find out your opinions on these points. The first one being racism, science bias, and then the perpetuation of racism through that bias. And what I mean by that is we often encounter journals talking about different diseases and discussing the outcomes of the disease or implications of the disease. They break it out along ethnic background, African Americans, Caucasians, Asians, and this seems to have a negative effect in a very race-conscious society that we live in. And in particular, like I've done some research on like premature infants. And one thing that is repeatedly heard in journals is that African Americans have a tendency to have premature infants. And in fact, you find that if you take away, it has nothing to do with race, but more with social demographic factors and how this influences their access to care and et cetera, and thus leading to premature birth. So I wanted to find out what the panel thinks about that, just implications of racism in our society, race consciousness, and how that affects how we go about doing our science in the first place. And the second point was the Human Genome Project, which should be completed in 2005, if I'm correct, I'm not sure. And just finding out from the panel, what do you think are the implications that will have on, or how does race and gender affect how we will handle something like the Human Genome Project and where we will use that information, and the potential benefits of the project and the potential disadvantages of that project.
Can we start with the first question? Maybe Dr. Frontera or Dr. Del Vecchio, good? Please.
Let me address the first question that you raised around race bias. One of the things that's most important, I think, is to look at how questions are framed. And when I mentioned that politics matters in science, it's the framing of the research question. Again, I'd like to refer to some recent work that's been done by people at the School of Public Health. Instead of just defining the relationship or the correlation between race and particular health or disease profiles, what we find are some very interesting issues being raised. It's not just SES that people are beginning to look at, but they're looking at issues of racism. They're looking at measures of disrespect, which is the work by Kennedy at the School of Public Health. He's looking at how disrespect is related to hypertension. And so he's trying to introduce a kind of social process that captures not the categories, but the experience of people, and relates to health outcomes or consequences, serious consequences for health. Again, in a very recent article this past week in the New England Journal of Medicine, by looking at race as a category, people have been able to identify discrepancies in the kind of health services or the kinds of interventions that are made. They were looking at cardiac catheterization, and they're looking at how does race affect the kind of work that physicians do. It's not that people are necessarily intentionally intervening in or trying to structure a person's health care because of their race and considering necessarily their SES. But it's a social process. Capturing that social process, I think, requires a reframing of research questions that have been asked for many, many years. And so what we're seeing is really a breaking open of the way race has been thought about, I think, and the way racism has been thought about in the whole domain of health research. And that's something that I would say has happened in the last 5, 6, 7 years. And it's because there are people who have come out of the African American community to reframe those questions. Very interesting.
But it's only because of the existence of racism that it's even a question to be raised. What difference would it make if it turned out that people with African ancestry, for some purely biological reason, had a higher frequency of premature children? The only reason it could make any difference is because you're looking for some excuse to make trouble. Let us say, I haven't heard anybody say yet, although it has happened in the past, of course, I haven't heard anybody say recently that because Ashkenazi Jews have a higher frequency of Tay-Sachs disease, which is clearly biological, that's a good reason for, say, denying them health care or not doing investigation of Tay-Sachs disease. I mean, what flows from the demonstration that some difference between two groups is or is not biological? Something only flows if you start out with a racist assumption in the first place.
Could I make a point in reference
please.
to the second question? I think that with your question pertaining to the Human Genome Project, I think there's two questions that have to be, or two issues that should be considered in determining the benefits and the disadvantages. The first question actually comes from a class that I'm taking with a panelist here, Professor Good. I'm in her medical sociology class, and I remember that the first lecture, one of the questions that she asked us to think about that's written in her book, American Medicine, The Quest for Competence, is what do we care about? And I think if you're looking at any scientific project or endeavor, you do have to ask, what do we care about? And essentially, the second part of that is who cares about the knowledge? If all of this information is derived and discovered and uncovered, and it just sits there, but you don't have people that find that it's relevant to them, it won't do those people any good. And this is similar to the point that I made earlier about if you don't have sufficient representation, be it racial, gender, or otherwise, in the fields of sciences or in any other field, that information can sit there and will be marginally or used by the extent that it benefits those people who are present. It is a money field. It is a field that has a lot to do with politics, as others here have said. So I think in determining the benefit or the disadvantage of any sort of project, it is important to realize that it won't go any further, and the information will sit unless you have people that care about the information and that will use that information to benefit the people that they represent.
Any other comment on the Genome Project, then? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment about that because as a practicing physician, of course, we hear many times that this project will change the way we practice medicine, the change we treat patients, and that may be true. And I think if you think about it, it has the potential to do that. On the other hand, I do, as a physiologist, believe that we have a long way to go before we get there. Because I think that we have to, from the genetics research, come back to the physiology of the human body and think about all of the interactions between genes and et cetera, that may alter a disease process. And I think we have to do much more research in that particular area. It's like integrating all of that information and the knowledge that we have about the physiology of the human body before we can really see the impact, the true impact of all of that information that may be out there in a few years from now. So I think it's we have a long way to go the way I see it.
May I make a comment or a statement? I don't know if this is in response to something someone has said or maybe a further issue for discussion, but I think about the culture in which my parents are from, a homogeneous African society in which everyone is the same, essentially, in that most people adhere to the same cultural values and traditions and so forth. And I actually remember speaking briefly with Dr. Counter sometime earlier this week where he was telling me that in cultures, for instance, where the norm may be blonde-haired and blue-eyed and otherwise, for them, there's not this pursuit of trying to achieve or attain certain levels of perfection or idealism. And I think that it is an interesting point to consider how these issues that we're discussing here fit outside of the American society, in that in some societies, as others here on the panel have implied, there might be very little relevance for some of these discussions, or at least the context in which they're presented here. If everyone is the same and everyone believes the same and they don't look to the outside for their standards of anything, for them, these issues of cloning and gender, race, they might not have the same value. And I think that that's an interesting point that maybe if it's appropriate for me to pose a question to the panel, maybe others who have had experience in societies like that could speak of.
Well, maybe we can address it along the way. We're running out of time, and I thought we'd try to get a couple, one last question in, but as this gentleman's here, we'll take his as well. If you could make it a brief question, sir, because
Sure.
we're just about at the end of.
Yeah, I'd like to bring up just a little comment that I hope it's not simply anecdotal, that relates to a technical aspect of cloning. And but what I mean to say is that so far the animals that have been cloned, the way we're talking about it here, have been sheep and mice. And in all those cases, cloning involved taking an adult cell and from there regenerating a whole adult genetically identical to the individual where that cell was taken from. And in both cases, the donor was a female, because the only cases when cloning was successful so far in animals was from mammary gland cells and ovary cells. And in the last work that was done in mice, and people in the field know this, and this tells you a bit about the bias we were talking in biology, researchers tried like hell to clone a male from testis, and they couldn't. There was no success. And of course they will eventually. But so far, if you were to use the techniques that are available in the field to clone humans, you would only be able to clone women, which I guess is a little more than just anecdotal, but I wanted to leave you with that.
Are you a biologist, sir?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Professor Haig, do you want to say anything on that, or anyone? Is that?
Could I ask you a question?
Yes.
Please. What's happened with the large number of cows that were attempted? Have they all failed? There were a bunch of them in which they were in fairly advanced stages
I don't, yeah, that's true. I think the cows were also from mammary glands, I suppose.
Did they succeed or fail? Do you know?
My understanding.
I think they've succeeded in doing it, but also from other cells.
From memory.
Yeah. But I mean, it will be possible to do it from other cells, I'm sure.
My understanding at the moment is that, particularly in the cows, that they do produce some cows clones that survive, and they produce other clones that look like they're a perfectly successful clone, and then they die soon after birth for unknown reasons. So there's a heck of a lot that we don't know just what's going on in this cloning.
That's going to touch on what Professor Ruth Hubbard was saying, is that out of the Dolly was 1 in 200 and something, and it was the only one that was successfully cloned. And out of those, a few arrested very early on, so you could discard them, but many were born, and then they turn out to have a very small liver, or, I mean, could you imagine these things happening in humans? That's another interesting question.
Thank you, sir. And one question here?
I have a different context for bias in a larger sense, and I think that, just to tell you where I'm coming from, I always have this picture in my head about maybe my grandchildren or my children doing a open heart, self-directed surgery at home. And I kind of keep that picture because the bias that I see here is actually a bias to the domains of science and medicine and so forth, and all the rest of us out there who are about to grab that from you and use it for ourselves will wipe out the biases I think you're talking about when we get to really take the information that is now more and more in our hands. And I'm just wondering if that is perceived by anybody there as a bias to protect. I think Professor Lowenton talked about the ability to continue making money as opposed to what should be happening out there in society, and our ability ultimately to shape the bias individually rather than have you shape it for us.
I think my feeling would be that if it could be made to do, if you could do it at home, it would become a department at Home Depot, and somebody would still make money out of it. Let's say, in a commoditized social circumstance, you can't escape from commoditization. It may not be in the hands of the experts, it may be in the hands of the home tinkerer, but the home tinkerer is still going to pay for it.
It's not about money, though, is it? It's about power, and it's about your own ability to exercise
Since
where
money
and what you want
itself
to
is
go.
fetishized, I mean, it's hard to know, but proximally it's about money, even if ultimately it's about power.
Okay, any other final words on that? Well, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and particularly Ms. Kathy McLaughlin, who really made today possible. I know she likes very large crowds like this, and she's accustomed to hosting many events here, and she's always done such a wonderful job. So I'd like for us to thank, first of all, Ms. McLaughlin for making this possible. And then I would like to say thank you to our panel, to express my appreciation to Dr. Richard Lewinton, to Dr. Walter Frontera, Dr. Mary Jo Delvecchio Good, Dr. David Haig, Ms. Nana Coleman, and Ms. Elizabeth Chow, all of you, for making contributions to this topic. I'm sure we'll continue to discuss this in the biology department and the science programs. Tomorrow morning, by the way, we'll carry this discussion to children. We have about 60 children coming into the Science Center tomorrow, where we'll put on demonstrations in science to encourage young women and minorities to enter the fields of science. We'll have physicists, biologists, chemists there with demonstrations, and we'll talk to students. We'll have our undergraduates and what we call partners in science pairing up with children to sort of introduce them to scientific experiments and that sort of thing. So you're all welcome to come out to that tomorrow morning at the Science Center, starting at 9 o'clock, going from 9 to at least 1:30. So thank you very much for participating, for joining us this evening. We appreciate your presence, and thank you again, panel.
And Al, we'd like to thank you for the many years you spent doing this kind of thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. Thank you for staying with us all.
Are you going to
Pleasure to do this.